Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and welcome to Chasing Legends. Welcome back to Chasing Legends. I'm Wayne Tuttle. I'll be your host this week. Please hit subscribe, hit the notifications bell, leave a comment if you want to leave a comment. Check out our About section, the t-shirts, Dutch Hunter Rendezvous, Legend of the Superstition Mountains, black and gray, short sleeve, long sleeve. Go to lustforgold.raceagainsttime.com or on their Facebook page, Lust for Gold Race Against Time, same name, and you'll find they have a sweepstakes going. It is 4 days, 3 nights in the Superstition Mountains, guided by REI. So that's a great sweepstakes to get on into. Download the film, check it out. Executive producer, and director Robert May, Academy Award winner. So it's a very cool project, very cool thing as it kind of runs its time out and other things start coming up. Getting into this week and we start moving forward. I wanted to kind of take a little bit of a sidestep, but it's chasing legends and stuff. Recently, someone came up to me and I just had a conversation. I think it was yesterday, which would have been Saturday. That was a brief conversation about Chupacabras and someone talking about a Chupacabra they'd seen in the mountains. And occasionally get that, they talk about it, and I became quite interested in it because one of the things to me was when you hear about certain of these aspects of different things, and we'll cover other, but this will be about the Chupacabras, was I'd never heard of them growing up. I'm in the 70s, 80s. I'd never heard of anything like that. You hear of all these different things, and that whole, what was it, the goat-sucking dog with bat wings and this whole concept of it. I'd never heard of it, so it was kind of odd when it started becoming part of the vernacular and you would hear about it. And I had some guys that worked out here that I was familiar with, Francisco and his uncle. I can't remember his uncle's name, and Peter Robles, and they would talk about some of these things. The guys from Mexico. And Francisco was a very firm believer in the Chupacabra. If you brought it up, he'd be like, oh yes, the goat-sucking bat. And he'd talk about it quite a bit. His uncle would be really dismissive, like old wives' tale of this stuff. But I never thought about asking more in depth about it. I always just kind of chuckled to myself. But I noticed the younger guys seemed to have this kind of belief, and then a lot of the older guys were very dismissive of it. There's, they look at, there's no such thing. Well, it caused me to become very interested, and one of the things I picked up was this book, Tracking the Chupacabra. Okay, it's by Benjamin Radford. There's only a handful of books about Chupacabras, a couple of early ones that went on. He does a great job because what he does, it kind of basically chronologically, he just covers the history of it. From its inception. And when you start thinking about it, a lot of people start realizing, yeah, I never heard of it, but it sort of came up. The Chupacabras came up around 1995. Now, there was a lot of attacks on livestock, and it was goats, chickens, mainly stuff like that, a lot of mutilations. And it would be like, oh, this farmer found, 10 or 15 dead chickens or 10 dead goats and all this, and the blood had drained from them. And as far as all types of mutilations, cattle, goats, chickens, this type of thing, rarely ever do they scientifically have any of the thing autopsied or checked out to see what happened afterwards, as much as you might think different. And with the Chupacabra, one of the things you find out is that it's generally something that was associated with it in Puerto Rico. So in 1995, and I think the big stirring was September of 1995. The woman's name, and I'm glancing over because I have to remember the name of the woman, Madeline Tolentino. And she's the first person to report seeing an actual Chupacabra. She's with her mother, they're in the house, she's looking out the window, they were talking, something going on. She looks out and sees this thing hopping. And She said it was this ugly, dark thing, and it had some wings on it, and it had like feathers or something ridged on its back that stood up, and it kind of hopped towards them. And she saw it and screamed and panicked, and then the thing took off. And she said there was a young man that was there, and he went after it, and it was in the newspapers, a big story about it. And then they decided this thing that she thought she saw had to have been the thing that had been attacking the goats and chickens in Puerto Rico, starting probably January, February earlier that year. So it's 1995. By 1996, the Chupacabras made its way to Mexico. Now it's kind of odd because it seems to have emanated. And when it was in Puerto Rico, it was said, the rumor was, it was the American scientists working there. There was an observatory there. And the American scientists working at this laboratory over in that area had been doing some genetical research, and something had gotten out. And they believed the Chupacabra was some sort of either alien species or something genetically DNA altered of these mixed of animals. And they blamed the Americans. And one of the problems initially we should all have it with is Puerto Rico, the size, and if there's all these Chupacabras running around, well, you would see more than one. But it was really that one eyewitness account. After that, there's a number of other ones. But about a year later, in 1996, the Chupacabras found its way to Mexico. And it starts kind of popping up, and people are eyewitnesses. In the time of 1996 through to 2000, the Chupacabra story starts popping up in places like Brazil and Chile. And then around 2000, it starts making its way into the United States, the southwest general area. Primarily Texas was one area, and New Mexico. They were two of the principal areas that there were. But by this point, the bat-winged creature with the spiked feathers in the back and all this had kind of turned into this dog-like creature. The wings started to disappear out, and people started coming up with carcasses of Chupacabras. And you've probably heard about this and seen stuff and pictures. And the book's a great resource because it shows pictures of the ones that people froze and preserved. And this gentleman went to all these people, all the eyewitnesses, and wherever he could get a sample, and tried to do samples. And wherever he genetically tested it, unfortunately for the people that want to believe in Chupacabras, all the American Chupacabras turned out to be basically manged coyotes, and in a few cases manged domesticated dogs that had been wild and feral. So it kind of seems like this pattern. So it still doesn't explain the initial of what happened, but by somewhere 2005, 2010, Chupacabras just sort of kind of fade away. There's not as many reports. You get the American occasional, whenever they test the animal, they test the fur, test the animal remains or anything of it, they find it's either a manged coyote. The only ones that they can't test are the ones where they didn't keep anything. But unfortunately, there's 4 or 5 people kept the carcasses frozen, proving it. And the gentleman in this shows the DNA results. He has the photographs. It's a great book because it explains to you the folklore and mythology of how this all starts to happen. But what's the source? And that was what intrigued me, because there's a number of good books about a lot of things, and I always love, and especially during summertime, I like to pick those things. In the 70s, I was a big fan, and even in the early 80s, there's the books like I Found Noah's Ark. There was a bunch of books about people who found Noah's Ark, and they found it in various different places, and there was always some sort of political turmoil, which meant they could not end up finishing the thing, which was always convenient. You had the gentleman, Cherish the Gods, Eric Van Daniken, who was pretty much just pummeled under eventually for a lot of the stuff in his books and stuff. But he has kind of reincarnated and survived, and people have forgotten about all the BS that happened and a lot of the stuff that was in his books that really didn't hold up at all. And now all that's come back, and Ancient Aliens and stuff celebrates a lot of that. And that's cool. If you want to believe in it, you want to believe in it. I always like to find those book sources, read a number of books about it, or always find the one where the guy does something of a chronological, basically tracking in history, which again, this book is really good. It's worth a read. And I'll be recommending through the next number of Chasing Legends. We'll go through some different legends and histories, and there's several books I'd like to recommend. Maybe I'll pop someone that aren't even related to what I'm talking about that I've read. One of them has to do with the Devil's Highway. I picked it up in Tucson during the film festival. Found it to be very well written. It doesn't matter how you feel about border control or migration or anything like that. It plays every side of it, and the gentleman who wrote it, I can't remember offhand, did a wonderful job. But in this case, in this book, I read it, and I love non-fictional material, and I'm reading down, and I find out, wow, early in 1995, they started promoting a film that was coming out, and the film was called Species, and very few people remember it. It was kind of did well for its time. It was kind of a sci-fi film, and it came out the summer of 95, 96, when all this is currying up, and there's the animal mutilations and all this stuff, and the film comes out and is getting promoted, and the promotional items are coming out. And if anyone remembers it, it's just like an alien being. It's kind of black. It's kind of hunched over. It has the little spikes on the back. And it kind of resembles, in this weird, vague way, the Chupacabra. What becomes even more interesting is in the Species film, it's set by the observatory in Puerto Rico. So actually, the film itself has the same story that came out of Puerto Rico about this, and it obviously was. There were mutilations, and people thought they saw some stuff. In fact, the woman who was the eyewitness, Tolentino, actually, when they re-interviewed her, basically 20 years or so afterwards, the story was very different of what she saw, the young man that went after the thing and kind of things. She didn't really alter her story. She said just basically her story was very different than what was printed in the paper, sensationalized compared to what happened. And so the book and the whole thing with this are great things of taking you into this area. If you're into this, all of this kind of different stuff like that, it's interesting because as well, he talks about in mutilations, how the blood settles in the bodies of animals once they've been attacked like that. And it generally settles down, centered, kind of low in the body cavity. So it'll seem like the body's drained. A lot of times in these things, the animals die of shock or what seems like very superficial wounds. What it is, and then the dogs, especially the feral dogs and the coyotes, can get very frenzied when they're around the animals that start to panic. They start to frenzy and panic, and they start going around killing random animals. That's why most of these attacks and a lot of mutilations, it doesn't seem like they tore the animal apart or fed on the animal. It seems like it was just like a craziness, and the animal dies and all that. So the book also kind of goes into detail on that type of thing, which is very interesting, which I've read about and talked to a number of people concerning, when I worked, and there was the dead cow pickup days, kind of understanding kind of some of this stuff of what happens with some cattle, and then there's people that kind of like overdo it a little on this. So the book is a great resource for helping you gain an understanding. I know some people aren't always into that real slow chronological detailed thing, but it is very interesting how the Chupacabra literally can be basically started from one basic source. Now, I know a lot of times there's the mythology, and it's the guy will say, well, there was indigenous people had stories of the Chupacabras back in the 1800s. And they really just kind of throw that out, and a lot of times what you'll find is they're just kind of morphing some other story or some mythology from that group into this. But this woman had a very detailed eyewitness account that just really seemed to fixate on something that was in a movie that was based right there where she was from this same place. So it's just kind of obvious of that. And it's kind of one of the reasons while like crop circles have seemed to dissipate. You ever notice that? The guys said they were making them and people said that was impossible. We showed the video footage of the orb. Well, you don't see the video footage of the orbs making crop circles anymore, and you don't see. Seems like that stuff has died out big time. And there's going to be people saying, oh no, there's still lots of them. Well, but once the guys started showing how they were doing them and some of that stuff, and the people were seeing how they were, it dies out. Well, Chupacabras kind of faded except for a generation that probably their mothers said, the Chupacabra will get you. And that's what I think kind of happened. So the book is a really great resource, but as far as Chupacabras and the story and any Chupacabra and the superstitions, a managed coyote or something like that, if it's something you want to do to scare your kids and cause them to kind of go into some therapy or go out and get spooked by something, it's just not a good idea. I mean, these kind of things kind of overwhelm and take on their own atmosphere. And the Chupacabra story is an excellent one of 1995 up into the early 2000s, that people were actually writing books about the Chupacabras and doing research and studies. And they were trying to be very diligent, but they weren't scientifically testing or touching any of this stuff, because they just realized they can make something off of it. So it's a great story. And I always appreciate when people share things and talk about these things and all this stuff. Spending a lot of times out in the mountains, and definitely not only just in the superstitions, but different areas in the Southwest, people will begin to believe in something that necessarily isn't real or true. And it doesn't mean just because it doesn't exist, it isn't real to them. And I kind of understand that at this point in my life, as there are people that even with this, they could read the book, they could look at all the details and understand there was a Chupacabras in 95, and we can literally pinpoint it, and we can take it to here and realize, oh, there's just, scientifically they've been able to kind of wipe this out. And everything that was tested, and well, that kind of shuts the book on it, right? Closes the book on it, chapter and verse. And yet there's going to be people that are going to find one little thing. And it's funny, because you always generally say, if there's one little thing that points the other way, there's always going to be something intangible that doesn't make sense in the whole rule of things. But if 99.9% of it just makes sense here, well, it's not that, it doesn't work that way when you're looking at the opposite things. It's that one little thing. Well, my uncle claims that my cousin saw a Chupacabra and it flew away into the night. Well, we don't have any video, we don't have any, but they will still believe it. So if people want to believe in that sort of thing, fine. I would suggest for all of them to ease their worried minds so they can leave their windows open at night. Pick up the book, read the book. So that was Chasing Legends this week. I hope you kind of enjoy that, because I want to touch on some of that mythology and that stuff when people remind me of things they see in the mountains and talk about these things. I've not seen the little people with, one leg shorter than the other. Not seen the pygmies. I've not seen the lost indigenous tribes or those lost Egyptians or the serpentine people. We can talk about it, and I'm not necessarily going to poo-poo it all, but I'm going to also point out that I've not seen those things. So spending a significant amount of time in the mountains and not ever coming across it basically tells me, as I would say, I can't give you any proof or backup. I would give you the opposite, that a lot of those types of things just can't simply exist, because I would think out there by myself I would have ran across something, some evidence. So there you go, Chasing Legends this week. Can't wait to join everybody for next week for another edition. Until then, everyone take care and have a good week.